Welcome to the Forgotten Franchise, the show where we look at anything lost or forgotten in the gaming world. Today, we'll be taking a look at De Blob and its sequel, De Blob 2. Let's get started. When we think of how a major studio or publisher comes up with an idea for a new game, we probably think of a group of designers brainstorming ideas on a whiteboard, or maybe a group of executives sitting in a boardroom deciding to renew their annual franchise for yet another year, or remaking a game that only released 13 years ago. But sometimes the idea for a game can come from a more interesting place. 9 college students, 8 of which were attending the Utrecht School of Arts and 1 of them attending Utrecht University, made a game that quickly caught the attention of THQ. At the time, the city of Utrecht was going through some massive changes, including adding canals, a movie theater, and even a casino. The city wanted a solid way to communicate to the general public what their city will look like when the construction of various projects was complete. So they commissioned these college students to make a game that would show off what the city would look like. And this became the first version of De Blob. In this game, you control the Blob, a massive character that rolls around its environment. By rolling over and absorbing what the game refers to as paint men, you could become essentially a massive ball of paint. You can paint cars, buildings, trees, and just about anything within the city of Utrecht. If you play this today, you'll notice that this isn't exactly a deep experience. After all, the game was meant to be played for only a few minutes in an information center in Utrecht by curious people who want to know what their city was going to look like. So, at most, this was sort of a play and go experience. But as you'll see, the lack of depth is ultimately what will become one of the biggest flaws with the Blob franchise. But for these 9 college students, De Blob was a massive hit. But more importantly, they were able to sell the game to THQ in 2007. THQ handed development to 2 different studios for a full retail version of De Blob. Blue Tongue Entertainment to make the console version of the game, and Helix Entertainment to make a DS version. Let's start with Blue Tongue Entertainment. Blue Tongue got its start in 1995 developing websites. They then made the transition to video games with their first title, AFL Finals Fever, published by none other than EA Sports. After AFL Final Fever, Blue Tongue was able to work on several titles that received strong critical and fan reception, including Starship Troopers, Terran Ascendancy, and Jurassic Park Operation Genesis. The team also cut its tongue, pun intended, on a variety of licensed games, but to not much critical success. Helix was also a studio wholly owned by THQ that exclusively focused on games for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS systems. Once again, lots of licensed games here, but unfortunately for Helix and THQ, the DS version of De Blob was cancelled relatively early in its development process. Blue Tongue Studios and THQ launched De Blob as a Wii exclusive on September 22, 2008, to a really solid critical and fan reception. So let's dive into the gameplay. De Blob 2008 is very straightforward. You play as De Blob, who was trying to recolor a city that was taken over by the evil Inked Corporation, whose goal is to drain all the color out of the city and of its people. To recolor the city, you'll jump on ink robots who will turn De Blob into one of 3 colors. De Blob will then jump on buildings, trees, and people to bring color and life into his environment. This is a really simple mechanic. Red Blob paints buildings red, blue Blob turns buildings blue, and so on. But this simplicity means you can really transform the city from a dull-looking metropolis into a city filled with your own creativity. You'll also be able to select from a variety of styles that will go underneath the paint to give each building more than just a color facelift. It gives all the buildings a really cool graffiti-looking style. The ability to mix colors is also there, so if you want to paint a building orange, you'll have to attack both a yellow and red ink bot, turning Blob orange. This mixing of colors is often required by the game's challenges, which are essentially just the missions of the game. Most challenges will require you to paint a block or a certain building a certain color, but there are other primary mission types as well. One mission type is essentially getting from point A to a point B as fast as possible, while another mission type is battling lots of enemies. But here is the biggest issue with the game. There are only a few types of missions that you'll be able to complete while you're playing this game. There's just very little variety here. Each level is composed of 3 sections. In each section, you'll play 3 different mission types, get enough color points by running over ink bots to paint landmarks. Then you'll move on to the next section and eventually complete the level. But this is really it in terms of core gameplay. There simply isn't a ton of variety here to justify a full playthrough. You move from level to level, coloring the environment, completing the missions, and then moving on to the next level. level. The camera in the game is also a massive negative. It often seems to get stuck on a piece of geometry behind the environment or behind the player and makes platforming or coloring specific buildings, and only specific buildings certain colors, incredibly difficult. But maybe, just maybe, it's okay that this is a simple experience. Let's look at the Blob for what it is. As mentioned, it releases a Wii exclusive, a platform where the majority of the audience are kids or young families, so the Blob's simplicity helps it in two areas here. It allows for easy motion control integration, and the concept of each mission is very understandable. Plus, it gives an outlet for creation, as kids can paint the city literally any color they wanted to. However, to the Blob's credit, it does do a few things to try to add variety to the gameplay, including jump pads that the player can perform QuickTime events on to jump from platform to platform, and it introduces a variety of enemy types throughout the game. All in all, The Blob is a fun and creative experience that I could totally recommend playing for an hour or two, but I can't escape the feeling that there were just a few missed opportunities with this title. It would have been awesome to let the player paint the buildings in sort of a freestyle way, where the building can be multiple colors instead of just one. And I wish there were more challenges in terms of platforming, as at its core, The Blob is an incredibly easy experience. So how do most review outlets feel about The Blob? As you can see, most outlets gave the game a B- to B rating. However, some outlets gave it an A- to an A rating. The general consensus is that this game was a solid third-party exclusive, at a time when the Wii did not have many quality third-party exclusives. So usually in an episode of the Forgotten Franchise, this is where I do some sort of a transition into the next mainline entry of the game. However, we've already seen that the Blob franchise is a franchise where the offshoot or similar games are an incredibly substantial and an important part of its story. So let's take a look at a few of those offshoots. In 2008, a few months before De Blob's release, the Blob Revolution was released for iOS devices. The Blob Revolution was essentially a maze game where De Blob has to go around saving Gradients. Gradients are essentially the citizens of the De Blob universe who have had their colors zapped out from them by the Inked Corporation, while also leaving behind him a trail of paint that he is unable to cross, or you'll have to restart the level. What's really baffling about this is not that the game itself or its gameplay or anything like that, it's that the game actually retailed for a whopping $10 at the time. In the same year, De Blob's Swatch Challenge was also released, a Flash game that was meant to promote De Blob on the Wii. In the Flash game, De Blob has to paint all the buildings in his environment while avoiding Inkies, who are just the enemies in the Blob franchise. So obviously, none of these experiences are really anything to write home about, but as games to promote their main title releasing on the Wii, they're absolutely fine in their own right. After De Blob, Blue Tongue Entertainment went on to work on Marvel Superhero Squad, which didn't really receive all that great of critical reception. But after that, production was in full swing on De Blob 2, and this time De Blob made an appearance on the Wii, Xbox 360, PS3, and even this time launched successfully on the Nintendo DS. From purely a visual perspective, this sequel looks like a sequel. The game has had a visual overhaul, improving on the original style without turning it into something completely unrecognizable. The best part of this overhaul is that the environments are much more differentiated than they were in the original, and you're no longer spawning into a massive world of gray. Take this first level here for example. There is actually an impressive amount of color here before we've even touched anything. Later levels even transport Blob to different looking cityscapes as well. The best features of the original game are still here, including several improvements. For example, there are now pools of paint that the Blob can use to color himself, but the inked spots are still there if you need to mix colors as well. De Blob 2 also tries to differentiate its gameplay by introducing these underground sections that are completely in 2D. These are a nice change of pace until, well, they aren't. You see, De Blob 2 does a really good job of trying to convince you that there is more depth here than there was in the original game, but that's just not the case. After the shine wears off, it becomes very apparent that you'll be doing the exact same tasks over and over. But give me a minute before you attack me in the comment section. Yes, the tasks are very similar to that of the first game, but everything else is so much more refined that it makes up for it. The jumping, coloring, and platforming is all really fun and cohesive. De Blob can also be upgraded in several different areas to improve his overall performance, and is given movesets that were absent from the original game, including the ability to bash through weaker walls. De Blob 2 also tries really hard to interject humor into the game through various conversations with NPCs, and some of the setups for these quests are actually really funny. Thankfully, the game is also a bit more difficult than its predecessor, but I still would have liked it if it was a little bit harder. So, how was De Blob 2 received? Well, unfortunately for Blue Tongue Entertainment, it was received less positively than its predecessor, with most outlets giving it a C+ score. This is honestly really surprising, as although it has its flaws, I very much feel that this is better than the original game. So what about the DS version of The Blob 2 developed by Half Brick Studios? Well, Half Brick Studios was honestly a really solid choice to develop this game, as they have worked on portable versions of major franchises before in the past, including Ty the Tasmanian Tiger and even Star Wars. And honestly, De Blob 2 on the DS is actually pretty solid. Essentially, this is just the 2D portions of De Blob 2 from the console, just truncated down onto the DS. For a DS game, this isn't a half bad experience and could be fun to play for a few minutes at a time. However, it was very much in line critically with the reception that its console counterpart received, receiving a 75% C score by most outlets. So after De Blob 2, what was next for the series? Well, unfortunately, De Blob 2 never received a proper sequel. However, there was an attempt to launch a game titled The Blob Online, which would have allowed players to fully customize their own version of De Blob and face off against other players in a city that looks very stylistically similar to the city that we see in the original De Blob. But as you might have guessed, this game never saw the light of day. The only reason its existence is known publicly because of this tweet from Richard Brown, who, according to his LinkedIn, was formerly the vice president of core studios at THQ. I really wish this game would have came out. I've always had a soft spot for these big multiplayer games like the Blob Online or Toontown or City of Heroes, and it could have been potentially something special. There is also very vague mentions of a De Blob TV show that was supposed to launch on Sci-Fi, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of information about this topic, and obviously it didn't come out. But I feel like a De Blob TV show would have been rather successful, as the quality of the CGI cutscenes in both games are always great and really funny. There was definitely something left on the table with this concept that I wish some TV station would pick up and explore. So has De Blob seen any success or life since the launch of De Blob 2? Well, thankfully, yes it has. Thanks to veteran developer Blitworks, a port for both De Blob and De Blob 2 was released for the PS4 and Xbox One in 2017, and the Nintendo Switch in 2018. I can only speak for the Xbox port, but it plays very well, and the footage you've been watching for both games are the Xbox versions. So what was next for the De Blob franchise? Well, that's really been it. It's good to see that there was a re-release of these games in the recent past. This could mean that THQ Nordic is testing the waters for a potential De Blob 3 or a complete remake. However, there hasn't been any news since the release of the Switch port in 2018. So what about all the developers that have touched this franchise over the years? Well, the news here for one studio isn't all that great either. Shortly after the release of De Blob 2, THQ closed Blue Tongue Entertainment as a part of a strategic realignment to steer development away from licensed kid titles and movie-based entertainment properties. But like all industries, money talks, and this is amplified by 10 in the video game industry. And while the original De Blob was successful, its sequel was not. It had an initial goal of 75,000 copies in its first month, and according to Eurogamer, came well short of that goal. And unfortunately for Blue Tongue, publishers don't tend to give developers any wiggle room when it comes to sales, and especially when THQ itself was struggling financially. So what about the other studios, Half Brick Studios and Blitworks? Well, shortly before the release of De Blob 2, Half Brick Studios made a little game called Fruit Ninja, which obviously is a massive hit. They then squeezed 10 games out of this franchise while continuing to produce various Android and iOS releases, and have shifted away from any other video game platform, and honestly, good for them. They clearly have a lot of success here and are making some really fun experiences. But what about Blitworks? Well, they continue to find a lot of success porting games to various platforms and seem to have really built a solid business model. So let's throw it all the way back to the beginning of the episode. How about the team that made the original De Blob? Well, according to Wikipedia, 5 of the original members founded Ronimo Games. Ronimo Games has found success with their Awesome Knots franchise, as well as their Swords and Soldiers franchise. I haven't played any of these personally, but they do look like a fun time. But what about the other remaining members? Well, as you can see on the screen here, they've had successful careers of their own. Honestly, I don't believe that we've seen the last of De Blob. With THQ Nordic re-releasing it as recently as they did, and the general public still somewhat hungry for it, I think it's a real possibility that we'll get a De Blob 3. But what do you think? Be sure to let us know in the comments below and like and subscribe for more content. Thank you for tuning into this episode of The Forgotten Franchise. If you liked what you saw, be sure to check out one of the other videos on our channel, or another episode of The Forgotten Franchise. But most importantly, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.